everyone, and welcome to SunDance's open house. This is a really exciting time for us. We have acquired a new facility, which you guys have already seen. We have new equipment and new processes available for our clients. I'm Susanna Toppa, our company's creative director, overseeing marketing and design. I have over 15 years of experience in the print and design industry, and this is Dave Leyrer, our finishing expert. I'll give him a few minutes to talk about himself.
Hi everybody, I'm Dave, and I've got a couple more years on Susanna in the print industry, but just 9 months here at SunDance, and very happy to be here. Glad that y'all could make it out today, and we hope that over the next 30-40 minutes we're going to be able to share some good information with you on the topic of die making. So Susanna?
Thank you, Dave. So we'd like to discuss this amazing world of die cutting, and I'm not being facetious, it really is exciting. For print buyers and for creative people, it really brings your pieces to, and it has an essential facet of bringing your pieces to another level just by using this creative technique. For print buyers and marketing people, I think it's a great opportunity for you to learn what questions should be asked on finishing options and really taking a look at what your finishing specs mean when they're given to you. So in printing, die cutting is the process of cutting paper into a specific shape using a steel die. As you can see in the picture here, which you'll probably see later as Dave takes you through the end of the seminar, this is what it looks like. It's kind of like creating a cookie cutter for each sheet of paper. A die can be used purely for a function if there needs to be a specific shape for the piece to work, like a door hanger. Very simple. This kind of usage is pretty straightforward and self-evident. Where it gets really interesting is where dies are used to enhance the message in a significant way. This is achieved by increasing the time your audience looks at the piece, getting them to interact with the piece, and in best cases, actually enjoy that interaction. Some of you may have seen this before. We did this a couple years ago, and it's actually a roll fold invite. It's a save the date. It comes up, save the date, and very literally stands up very large. Let's jump into a few best practices and guidelines. Most of these should be listed on the checklist that you have with you, but I'll also go through them very quickly there. And these are basic do's and don'ts. So make sure that your art is clean, scalable vector path. Create your path as a spot color and in another layer so it's easy to turn on and off. 100% magenta is usually the industry standard on this. Set your die line to overprint so it doesn't knock out your artwork underneath. Use a different spot color or a dotted line when designated score lines. A perforation can also be designated with a dotted line. Use offset path to create bleeds when you have a complicated shape. Offset path can only be used in Illustrator, but if you have a complicated shape, you should probably be using Illustrator anyway to create your bleeds. Now let's get into some more complicated dies. Dies that have glue tabs, you'll want to make sure that all of your glue tabs are at least 3/4 of an inch. Flip your die line on the opposite page to ensure you're not folding or cutting into text. Knock out ink on the other side so you won't have any issues with glue. Definitely account for folding. When panels are folding on top of each other, make it so a panel is shorter so you'll have a cleaner, easier fold. The example here you'll see one panel is shorter than the other, so that you're able to actually have the piece fold cleanly and evenly. Some common mistakes that I've seen are people setting up roll folds or different type of trifolds, and they'll set each panel up as an even increment. Unfortunately, because paper has its own thickness, folding it upon itself actually compounds that, so you'll have to decrease each panel by about 1/16 of an inch. Accounting for the paper thickness is probably a good idea. And you'll also want to do what you can to prevent cracking. If you have a heavy gloss finish like a UV coating and your piece folds, you'll want to knock out the pieces that UV in order for it to not crack. This is a pretty good example of that. Excuse me. And this piece spot UVs, but on the score lines, you'll actually see where it's knocked out. and it gives a really nice clean score as a result of that. But when you actually convert your job, even if it's a flood UV, to having score lines on them, it actually changes the cost of it. It'll be a little bit more expensive because now it changes to a spot UV job, but it's worth it in the end because your result is self-evident. You want to consider laser cutting if you have a really complicated die and a low volume. I have an example here, and it's one that we've done before. Some of you may actually have seen it before. And it's got really intricate die cuts that could have also been done with a laser, but we chose to do it with a steel die instead, but it was really expensive die just because there were so many cuts. Because if your volume is maybe around 100 to 50 to 100, it'd probably be a good idea to go with laser cutting as an option. And think about your paper choice. Thinner paper has less resistance and generally cuts cleaner. Thicker paper may feel nicer but may not lay completely flat and when you're folding multiple times. And finally, don't send your final piece to us without printing out a mock-up first, even if it's a mini mock-up. We usually have a lot of templates and dies available online. This slide here, it shows where you can get it on the website. When you begin the process of die making, you really want to start with this flow. First, you want to start with the product. If you have a product, you want to make sure your packaging can fit around the product and make sure you have your sizing right. And if you actually are doing a packaging design, unless you're a structural designer, I would really recommend that you send it to us and have us supply you with the die line. Packaging die lines are actually really complicated, so you don't want to take that on by yourself. If you don't have a product, then you want to go to mailing. If your piece mails, or if it's a self-mailer, like you have a die cut of a shoe, you'll want to make sure that actual die cut piece can run through with USPS standards. If you're deciding to fold it and putting it into an envelope, make sure the envelope actually exists that you can then spec out for the job. Once you're done making sure that those two things are covered, then you can create your die line. And once you're done with your die line, then you can start with your artwork. This flow will probably eliminate a lot of errors down the long run and really checking your bases beforehand. So I'd like to now take you through the journey of one of our more complicated dies. For those of you familiar with some of our internal items, we can do some crazy, wacky die lines, as some of the samples I even showed you can prove. And I think it's really one of the great things about SunDance. We're definitely willing to push all boundaries and do whatever looks cool. We definitely have a team that supports that. The open house invitation is one I'd like to focus on. You've all may have received it in the mail or have seen it and are pretty familiar with it. But we really wanted to showcase our incredible growth at the company and tie in this Earth Day theme. So we had the idea of taking an old notion, which is essentially maybe a flat Earth, and really transforming it into something that was unexpected and really cool, like a round or spherical Earth. So it's also serving as this great metaphor for us thinking outside of the box and being really growing and transforming into this much bigger, greater company. How can we take this idea of something square and essentially turning it into a circle? The piece needed to be interactive and something people could really play with and spend a few minutes on. We knew it had to end up as a circle but start as a square, so I took a stab in the dark and that was my first die line. Obviously, that didn't fly, and that definitely wouldn't work. Dave kicked that back to me and said, I cannot do anything with this. So I then set myself on the task of searching for inspiration by looking at old pieces and researching on the internet. I searched the blogs and YouTube pages and Pinterest pages of other people just as passionate about die lines as I was. I'd say unless you're a structural engineer, this is a pretty good way of drawing inspiration. True invention is great, but when you have to consider time and budget, it's probably better to modify something that already exists and really make that your own. So with that in mind, I found something that we could use as a starting point, and it was a pinwheel fold. The pinwheel fold's great. It has a square and it kind of starts off as that and maybe goes into a circle, but it really didn't give that wow that I wanted. People have done pinwheel dies before, and I really wanted something that was gonna be big and larger than life in everyone's face. So, and I really didn't want to compromise. And what we started with was this mock-up. It's kind of just my torn up piece of paper sitting late at night trying to see if this works, and this is kind of where it started, and it's definitely a failed prototype. So we went over and over again trying to get it to work, and actually I began to get so frustrated. I gave it to Dave and I said, Dave, please make this work. One of the problems we had was as we were folding it down, the circle would snag on each side of the die line. So it became increasingly difficult to get that working. But then finally Dave and the team were great enough to get a working die line, and the only problem now was, how do I get this into Illustrator? There were plenty of angles and curves, and if anyone's familiar with working in Illustrator, you know how easy it is to get circumference and pi directly translated into Illustrator. So with that not working out, I actually ended up with this crazy mad scientist drawing of extreme numbers and dimensions in order to get this to work. So what you have is me trying to find a symmetrical pattern and a rhyme or reason to get everything to line up as evenly as we want it to. So we finally were able to get exactly where we needed to with the help of Dave, and we got the okay to finally start making the die. So we've now made it so. So now that we have a working die line, our next hurdle was to actually get it approved with management. I have a real insider tip of getting it approved with management. Make sure it's a really exhausting week and do it at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday. You are almost guaranteed to get that approved. And actually that's how this one pretty much got approved. So once we got it on press, we actually encountered paper issues. So on top of more issues, we ran into some paper trouble. There's a picture of one of the ones that we did that we actually laminated. One of the problems we had was there are so many scores and lines on this piece going in different directions against the grain and with the grain that it was just a recipe for an unappealing product. Laminating the product did actually get rid of a lot of these errors, but in the long run, it didn't really lay flat, and it really wasn't the look that we wanted. So we eventually decided to print it on an uncoated stock. It actually ended up printing on an 80-pound uncoated text. It looked great, it laid flat, and it was exactly what we wanted. So we have success. I'll just take a quick second to show you what it looked like. So when you opened it out of the envelope, it was, "You're invited to see our new world." And then you turned it around and you got "Welcome to the new SunDance." And then you pulled it apart to get this huge reveal of the information on the invite. So I believe that we finally achieved a successful message that we wanted to get across, and really achieved genuine surprise with a structurally clever and enjoyable product. So the biggest lesson that I can really leave with you all is, while you can do all the mathematical calculations that you want, a physical mock-up on the actual stock is the absolute best way to ensure that you have a functional die. Don't be afraid to print it out and test it. A good rule of thumb is, if you can print it out and fold it and it works, then we can print it out and fold it, and most likely it will work. Whether you do this through getting a mini plotter or using us as a resource, definitely encouraged for you to actually print it out. As a company, we typically like to tinker and do a lot of cool things, as long as they're cost effective. One of the things I wanted to point out that I see all the time are pocket folders. When artwork comes over, people will tend to want to set this up as they read it. They'll have the insides set up like this, and then they'll have the pockets here. But if you actually unfold it and unglue it, you'll see that that's not how pocket folders are made. The pockets are actually printed on the front cover, and then they're folded and glued up. But this is a simple error that could have been resolved if someone took the time to print it out and make sure that it actually folded right, and then you definitely see how this is put together. So in the interest of being innovative and kind of doing things outside of the box, I also just wanted to show one of our other invitations that we've done. Some of you may have been familiar with this already, and actually it's one that probably makes Dave cringe. because this also went through a similar process. But it's a inserted flippy kind of flip book die that we did for an invitation a few years ago. So one of the things I get asked often is, how do you come up with this stuff? And typically it's by a row of disgruntled bindery workers hand-folding some of the projects that I've given them. But I collect samples, I constantly look around for inspiration, and try to build off of what's already done. On the handout are some of the resources of some of my favorite places to get inspiration. So once again, tinkering is its own form of genius, and that's really what we employ when we do all the crazy things that we do here at SunDance. All right, well, if you guys can get up for a second, Dave is gonna lead us out to the back to see the physical process of die making.
Okay, well, I'm going to start by asking everybody just kind of think about some of the things, die cut products that we come in contact with every day. It could be playing cards, it could be pocket folders, credit cards are die cut, labels are quite often die cut. There's a lot of different processes for die cutting. Behind you there are some examples of dies that we use. These are steel rule dies. We're going to go briefly over a couple of different types of die cutting. One type of die cutting is using the use of a high die. This die that I'm holding, this is a high die, and this is a little bit unique in that when you're doing a high die, you're actually pressing through an entire stack of paper at a time. Now, that could be 52 sheets, like a deck of playing cards, or it could be 500 or 1,000 sheets, depending on the thickness of the material that you wish to cut. So again, typically playing cards are a good example of the use of a high die. Quite often custom envelopes are made with a high die in smaller quantities. Larger quantities generally go to a rotary press. So rotary die cutting is when you have a steel die attached to a rotating cylinder. And generally, again, labels is one of the applications very commonly used for rotary, where you have the die attached to a steel cylinder that's rotating, and the continuous web of paper is drawn under the cylinder, and that's where the cut happens. Now, the type of die cutting we're going to focus on today is steel rule die cutting and die making. And behind us, you can see some samples of steel rule dies in various stages. The process begins when we get a die line from a graphic artist, from our art department, of course. And the first step in our process, once we receive that die line, is we're going to cut out a die board to the approximate size of our total piece. So we use a Russian birch, a 5/8 Russian birch plywood, very stable, it lasts a long time. So we take that die line, which is basically just a printed sheet, and then we spray mount it to the die board. Here you can see this is a complete die. You're actually looking at the back side of it, so you can see the die line here. Yeah, this is a pocket folder actually here. So yeah, and on the other side, the die rules are actually in there and everything. So now what happens after we've mounted that, we're ready to go to the next step, which is over here to what we call jigging the die. Now we call it jigging the die because it's so complicated. And if we're successful at it, we like to do a little dance when we're done, you know. Okay, no, really, we call it jigging the die because this is a jigsaw, and we use the jigsaw to cut the die out. Now, before we cut, though, we have to put some holes in the die. Now, we'll use the drill to place holes. We put them in pairs. There's always two together, 1/4 inch apart. And those holes are there. They do actually provide, they do two things. One, they provide stability for the die. They give us little bridges or ties in the die that helps to maintain the integrity of the die. And the other thing they do is they give us a place to stop and start our cuts. So we don't want to cut in from the edge of the die, so we've got to start somewhere in the middle. So we place those holes strategically throughout on the cut lines that we want to make, and then we're going to cut actually the lines out in between the sets of holes, but we'll leave those 1/4 inch bridges. Now at this point, Leon is going to go ahead and demonstrate for you guys how we actually cut the die. So Leon, if you would, let's go ahead and cut that for him. Now what you'll see here is that making the die is an art form all by itself. It requires tremendous technical ability. It also requires a kind of a creative intuition to be able to understand the artist's desire and what their intent is for the die to be able to do. You'll notice that he has a monitor up there that magnifies the view of the cutting area, which helps a lot in being able to make a very precise cut.
And it still, even with that, requires an incredibly steady hand. I have tried myself to cut a straight line, and even with the magnification, I can tell you it is extremely difficult. Leon will make it look easy. I could make it look very complex. Thank you, Eddie. Okay, you'll notice how he just drilled and he stopped when he got, stopped his cut when he arrived at that next hole, leaving that bridge intact. So we're not going to make you sit through the entire process of cutting that die. We've kind of broken this into steps. Now at this point, if we just can kind of imagine that this is completely cut out, we've done all of our connecting lines there, and then we were ready to move over onto the rule out area here. And over here, see a series of different machines and devices that we're going to use to actually carefully measure the die rule and cut it to length. Sometimes there's multiple pieces. The cutter can be set to be very repeatable, so we can cut very precisely. Now once we've cut it, the next step would be to bend it into the form that it needs to be to accommodate the die, if the die requires a curve, as this one does. Once that's done, there's one final step, and that is to place notches in the die rule. Those notches are to accommodate the bridges that we left in the previous step. So we've got to go around those bridges in order to go down into the die board. Now, Leon is going to show you how we actually install that into the die board. And he's got a kind of a special leather hammer there that he uses. The leather is soft, it will not damage the die rule as he taps it in. If we used a regular hammer, we'd make a bunch of nicks in the die, which would become ties when we go to make the actual die cut. Okay. Well, a couple of things will affect the longevity of the die. One, it will depend a little bit on what you're cutting. If you're cutting paper versus plastic, cardboard is very abrasive, it will dull the die quickly. And it also depends on the skill of the press operator. If the press is set up with too much pressure, you can damage a die in a single strike. But if the make ready is done properly, if you have a good skilled operator, that die should last anywhere from 50 to maybe as much as 200,000 impressions. So that again comes down to the skill and talent of the operator, you know, more than anything. Now there are different hardnesses of die rule available. We have a kind of a standard rule that we use, but you choose that not only depending on how long you're going to run. If you've got very, very high quantities, you want to use a harder rule, but if you have extreme bends, you have to avoid harder rule because it becomes brittle as it becomes harder, and you just can't make those extreme bends. So the design may call for to use a softer rule even though your quantity is high. Now that's really not the end of the world because the board remains intact, and if the rule becomes dull, we can pull that out, replace the rule. So we can replace that and continue to use that die board. Okay? So now, once this is done, and again, just like we did with the cuts, we'll kind of assume that this was completely ruled out, all the rule is in there, and then there's another final step that has to happen before the die is ready to go onto the press. We place these little rubber pads, and this is what we call ejection rubber, okay? And you might think that's there to keep you from cutting your finger. It does a nice job of that, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is actually a mechanical function that it does. When a steel rule die is in the press and the paper passes over, then it goes under pressure. Without the ejection rubber, the paper would sink down onto the steel rule and it would hang there. And when the press tries to advance the paper, it would just tear it and jam inside the press. So we place the ejection rubber around the cutting rule, and it actually, almost instantaneously, it lifts the paper back off of the die once the cut is made. And you can touch that, pass it around if you'd like. Just cut. You'll notice in the dies behind you there's black and red. Sometimes we use green. They're different hardnesses of rubber, and you can choose that depending on the type of substrate that you're going to cut. So now with that said, let's assume that we've had this all done and it's all, we've got the ejection rubber on, we're ready to go to press. So we're going to walk over to the die cutter over here. Now this is a Sagano die cutter. It is a flatbed die cutter. We're going to come up here. Now, we have already taken the liberty of mounting, of course, the die. This is the same die we're running here that you saw in Susanna's presentation. This is our invitation die. Tika, our press operator, is going to run off some samples. Now, the make-ready process, that's kind of the setup of the press, which we have already gone through, but I'll briefly describe it. We would start initially with generally the same make-ready paper that our press team uses to set up the press to print, and then that's brought over to us and we use it to get our rough position. Once we have the approximate position, we'll go to the good printed matter, pull off about 10 sheets and then stop and very carefully check every feature of the job, the scores, the perfs, the cuts, and make sure everything is just right. As you can see, sometimes it'll still hang up in the press when you're die cutting a large area like that. This is a circle, and we didn't want to put a lot of ticks in it, so it's a little bit delicate. So, okay. So now we can take these samples, and Tika's going to share these samples with you guys. You're welcome to take them, hold them, try to fold them. And let us know how you do, because if you can fold in under 52 seconds, we do have a prize, okay? And we also have applications up on the front desk. We're always looking for good hand labor. So 52 seconds is the record. We really appreciate each and every one of you. We hope that you'll consider us as a resource for your future projects. We love what we do. We love the business, and we're invested in your success as much as you are. Thank you.